Welcome to UO Today. I'm Barbara Altman, Director of the Oregon Humanities Center. Our guest today is Johanna Drucker, the Martin and Bernard Breslauer Professor in the Department of Information Studies at the Graduate School of Education and Information Studies at UCLA. Drucker is an author, book artist, visual theorist, and cultural critic. Her scholarly writing documents and critiques visual language, its letter forms, typography, visual poetry, art, and digital aesthetics. Drucker's research focuses on alphabet historiography, modeling interpretation for electronic scholarship, digital aesthetics, the history of visual information design, history of the book and print culture, history of information, and critical studies in visual knowledge representation. She has authored several books, including The Century of Artists books, which came out in 1995, Sweet Dreams, Contemporary Art and Complicity from 2005, and Spec Lab, Digital Aesthetics and Speculative Computing in 2009. Drucker is internationally renowned for her book art. Her work has been exhibited at universities, libraries, galleries, and museums throughout the world, including, among many others, Yale University, the New York Public Library, the Walter Phillips Gallery, and the Victoria and Albert Museum. While visiting the U of O, Drucker gave a book entitled Books, Art, Now on April 6, 2010. On April 17th, she gave a talk entitled Views and Vistas, and later that day she gave a workshop entitled Text, Shapes, and in Book Spaces. Her talks and workshop were part of the campus-wide Year of the Book series. Johanna, welcome to UO Today.
Thank you.
We've been waiting for you to get here. I'm so delighted to have the chance to talk to you. There's so many things that I'd love to ask you to talk about, but I think we need to start by asking you to define what is an artist's book.
Sure. Well, believe it or not, the term artist book is highly contested among many communities, and the definition of the term has given rise to considerable debates and incredible factionalism within the many communities who feel they have a stake. But I think really we can define an artist book fairly simply, which is it's an original work of art that takes the book form. And you know, that sounds straightforward, but what's implied in that is that the work doesn't have another form. It only exists as a book, and it comes into being as a work of art as it is produced, and it's produced as a book. So the difference really would be that in many cases, a book that is published as an artistic work might be, in fact, a catalog of an exhibit. It might be a republication of something that existed in another form. But really, an artist book we think of as something where the conceptualization of the project from the get-go is that it should take the book format. And where the contestation comes in really is in what constitutes a book format, because does that mean an altered book, a sculptural object, a scroll, a performance work that gives rise to documentation that gets folded up and sewn together? So what constitutes a book really becomes highly debatable in many circumstances.
You have said in your book, Century of Artists books, I quote you as saying, it could be argued that the artist's book is the quintessential 20th century art form. Mm-hmm. Could you explain why it's the quintessential 20th century art form?
Sure. You know, it's interesting now that we're well into the 21st century and thinking about what the status of the book is as we are moving into an increasingly digitally mediated environment for knowledge and creativity and so forth. And we might touch on that in a few minutes. But I think the idea of arguing for the 20th century art form came in part in response to an exhibition at the New York, at MoMA in New York, and that had been organized as a major exhibit of artist books by Audrey Isselbacher, and the exhibit took the title A Century of Artist Books. And in conceiving of the Century of Artist books, there was a kind of argument in response that we were making. And I say we because that book, The Century of Artist books, really came about through the prompting of Steve Clay, who's my dealer and publisher at Granary Books, as well as my then husband and collaborator Brad Freeman. both of whom felt that there was a community who had been participants in artist book production and conception in the 20th century who were somewhat marginalized by the MoMA exhibit, which tended to some extent to be broadly defined and to include a lot of work that came from mainstream art rather than to exhibit an understanding of the work that had been done exclusively in an artist book context. And my orthodoxies have relaxed since that time, but I certainly did feel that it was necessary to champion some of the work that had less of a profile and less visibility within the art world than the work that was already in the print cabinet at MoMA, for instance, or in the library at MoMA. That's a whole, even saying that begins to map some territories of interesting dispute about why are some things in the library, why are some things in the print cabinet. But to just go back to your question and answer it, I say the 20th century is the century because the combination of technological capabilities and availability of technology for artists to actually produce books, combined with a belief in the notion of democratic distribution and the idea of a kind of, strategic use of media to promote avant-garde agendas and aesthetic agendas through work that could reach a broader audience. And that is part of the avant-garde, and that really comes into expressed articulation in the first decades of the 20th century with the futurists in Italy and Russia, and then the Dada artists in Switzerland and France and New York and beyond. So the 20th century really is a unique moment in terms of the history of book production when the means of production become accessible and the artists become engaged in direct production of their own work. And that's a very important historical shift from earlier centuries. We go into more detail with that, but that's what makes the 20th century unique. Access to the means of production, desire to engage with production, and the sense that the book as a democratic instrument has a strategic role to play in artistic and aesthetic expression within a broader cultural agenda about the arts.
I began to understand some of the quarrels about terminology when I read your description of how artists' books differ from what you call livres d'artistes, the French term, which literally means artists' books. So
right.
it's a bit of a puzzle, a terminology puzzle, I suppose. But you were talking about the advent of the 20th century as producing conditions favorable for the artist's book. In contrast, however, this livre d'artiste in the kind of French tradition started a couple of decades earlier, late 1890s maybe, or?
The livre d'artiste really is an independent production that arises in the early part of the 20th century. We can link it to some extent to arts and crafts activities. I mean, book production changes in the end of the 19th century, and the kind of mythic, sort of canonical way of telling that tale is to say that, with the coming of William Morris and the arts and crafts movement, we see a deliberate engagement with the book as an artistic production, and the idea of really making it an aesthetic object. In fact, there are precedents earlier, and we see artists involved with books from the time there are books, and we can talk about medieval manuscripts, we can talk about Renaissance humanist books, we can talk beautiful deluxe editions of illustrated work throughout the history of the book. But the notion of the book as an aesthetic instrument really starts to be articulated in a theoretical way in the 1890s, both with Morris and the arts and crafts folks, T. Cobden Sanderson and others, Emery Walker, but also with some like Stéphane Mallarmé, the great French symbolist poet, whose theorization of the book really has a long influence. The livre d'artiste is a market opportunity. The livre d'artiste is invented by Daniel Kahnweiler and Ambrose Vollard and Albert Schira, and people who were part of the art industry and dealers who saw that by producing deluxe editions, they could have a subsidiary market that they were part of. And so it was, as an engineered product, and not that that's evil or pernicious, but it was, designed to actually be a marketable commodity. And so the terms of production were that it should be deluxe, it should have, very good paper, it should be, finely made, it should have a certain grandeur to it. And for artists, it often represented an opportunity to do something a little bit more experimental than what they were doing in their easel painting or what they were doing in their sculpture. And so you do see some interesting kind of aesthetic experiments in that domain. So the livre d'artiste has a very distinct lineage. I mean, we can sort of trace its history to particular moments and individuals who saw, what the potential was for this kind of production.
Among the artists that you list as having produced really magnificent and marketable livres d'artistes are Bonnard, Matisse, Miro, Max Ernst, Picasso, among others. And I would like to read one quotation from your work, because one of the things that I admire so much about your work is your use of language as you're talking about books. So there's this lovely sentence that you have in talking about livres d'artistes. You say, "The paper wrappers of these books can barely contain their thick paper pages, and the large scale of the typefaces is surrounded by a veritable swath of blank margin, while the images and text often face each other like new acquaintances across the gutter, wondering indeed how they came to be bound together for all eternity in the hushed, mute interior of the ponderous tome." That is a fabulous sentence. But it also makes it very clear that this sort of artistic book is a kind of a showpiece, right?
Yeah.
And it's not about manipulating the form of the book. It's about using the book to present something else. Is that accurate?
Yeah, I think that is accurate. And also, even to say that these artists, Bonnard and Matisse and Picasso, produced books is a misconception or misrepresentation of the process. These are publishers' conceptions of books. And we make a big distinction in the artist book community between publisher-initiated projects and artist-initiated projects. Picasso never initiated a book production. He was invited to participate in book projects by publishers or other folks who wanted to, use his magnificent talents and his graphic skills in a project. And of course, the person who is a unique figure within the livre d'artiste community and who might be called a book artist in many ways is Ilya Stanievich, or Ilyazd, who produced large-scale, beautiful livre d'artistes starting in the late 40s with Picasso and Max Ernst and Matisse and others. But he really did engineer these books. He was the kind of visionary producer of form, not just the visionary producer of product. And those two things are really different. A lot of what gets produced in the art world is product, right? It's high-end product. We don't mind that, It's like, we like product, right? We like nice shoes, we like nice clothes, we like nice art. But, high-end concept is more rare. And people who think through formal questions and conceptual terms and ask you to think, well, what is a book? What is a book now? What is a contemporary book? How do we understand what a book is? How do we wake up to the, habits of thought through being forced to encounter something that's not familiar? So, that's a very different set of questions than isn't it lovely to have this beautiful deluxe, sort of couch of paper on which to repose.
Another good sentence right there. I wanted to get back to the question of how we understand, display, collect artists' books. You mentioned the MoMA show and the whole issue of where they end up, which piece of a gallery, which piece of a collection. Yeah. Why have artists' books been omitted from surveys of 20th century art?
Well, sometimes we think that artist books occupy the same status that video art occupied about 20 years ago. Like video art, actually, artist books are time-based media. In a sense, you have to engage with the sequence, with the development, with the unfolding. And so how do you encounter a book? I mean, a book is designed for an intimate experience. It's designed for you to actually take the time to sit down and, lock your brain into the, sort of visual, graphic, alphanumeric sequences. And that's a very different experience, perceptually, cognitively, culturally, from the looking at an image, looking at a sculpture, looking at an installation. And so the context of display has built into it certain kinds of expectations. And I don't know what your kind of like patience level is, but you know, if I go to a large exhibition and I walk into the room and there's a video playing, I'm sort of like, well, is that 1 minute of a 15-minute video I'm seeing? Is that a 30-second loop? How do I know where I am in it? How long am I supposed to stay here in this room? And so I mention all of that because I think one of the issues with books is that they are temporal. You have to spend time with them. The question of where they stand institutionally and what their status is again troubles the professional communities of museums and libraries. And I had occasion to observe the extent of this trouble when I was at a Rare Book and Manuscript conference that's part of the American Library Association pre-conference activities. And it was a conference that was about museums and libraries. And the object that kept coming up to signify the sort of difficulties of domain separation and disciplinary authority and, you know, professional rules of decorum was the artist book. And, you know, you can believe how angry it makes people that, you know, when the print curator has decided that something is not worthy of being collected, that the librarian turns around and says, oh, but I want to have it. And this feels like surreptitious curating and, you know, legitimation of works that have no right to be in the museum according to the curator. And so, you know, all of these things are very interesting, and I was very gratified by the fact that artist books have remained unruly and that they trouble all of these people. It's like, oh, we won, you know, we're still the bad child. It's like, that's good, you know, it's still upsetting to people.
At least the defiant child, because you're refusing to conform to any of the institutional categories that have usually applied.
And inadvertently, I mean, it's not like that's what artist books set out to do. But, you know, so anyway, that's interesting. So where they end up is really still, you know, sort of across, even within an institution, you'll see there's a distributed sort of curatorial responsibility, and in general has something to do with budgets and, you know, things that cost a lot and are high end and up in special collections or in you know, museum collections, and things that are more affordable and feel like they are more accessible will often end up in the library or in the, you know, art library or whatever. So
your talents and your conceptual gifts, what you bring to this, and also your art making, seems to be at a very propitious moment in the shift in book production. We're at this watershed moment where once again the technologies are changing and we're questioning our reading habits and the media in which we read. How are you negotiating? How are you taking into consideration the move to digital formats?
Well, as you mentioned, it's something that is very timely, and I've been involved with digital activities for quite a while now. I got really interested in the aesthetics of digital media at the time when hypertext and new media were really starting to surface in galleries. So I was interested in the visual side and the design side, as well as the affordances of writing in a very different kind of environment. And it seems to me that a couple things have happened that are interesting. One is that we think differently about the traditional book and the codex and the print form because we have the possibilities of thinking about space and sequence and system and networked relations among elements of meaning. And that's caused us to go back and look at the book differently. So I'm very interested in what we can learn from the historical archive about the structure of information environments and aesthetic environments that then we can extend into dialogue with the digital space. How do we design a digital environment that has the conventions and codes that we're familiar with, but it takes advantage of the sort of infinite space of digital media, while still giving us a way of finding our way and knowing where we are. The wonderful thing about a book is you know where you are in it, and you know what all of the different graphical features are in relation to each other. You know what a footnote is, you know what a header is, you know what a chapter break is. But the digital environment hasn't yet evolved in that way. So I find the dialogue back and forth to be extremely interesting, and the design challenges that we're facing, I think, can well be nurtured by a careful investigation of historical precedents.
I'm fascinated by that connection that you're looking historically in order to inform what the possibilities might be in digital media. One of the key phrases that seems to come out of your Spec Lab book is that you are looking at how we can play with aesthetic subjectivity in a digital medium as opposed to analytic objectivism. And it's true that in some ways it's a very confining and structured medium because we need to code, we need to use binary systems. There are already conventions that are relatively rigid in some aspects of digital work, and you're trying to turn that on its head?
Oh yes, that was a lot of the goal of Spec Lab, which I founded at the University of Virginia with my colleague Jerome McGann and a graduate student Bethany Nowitzki and a whole host of other folks. But part of what we were trying to demonstrate were critical principles that came out of humanistic theory and had been part of critical theory for several decades. And those had to do with the identification of the position of the speaking subject, the notion of subjectivity as central to interpretive practices that are absolutely at the core of humanistic activity. And so we're trying to bring those back into the digital environment because the digital environment seemed to transform everybody back into sort of, odd pragmatic, sort of empiricists. And we were like, no, there has to be a way to actually demonstrate the role of subjectivity within interpretation as a core humanistic value. So we did a bunch of really provocative and interesting experiments in that regard. And it's a mission I'm still on. So
you have a lot of scope. This is not something that's going away, so you can engage with it for a long time. If I'm not mistaken, Jerome McGann also has a very acute sense of the historical practices of bookmaking, right? So both of you brought an understanding of older practices to the newest forms.
Yeah, it was a great partnership because we came from such different places and we were both really fully developed at the point of starting that dialogue. And I think my interests really were much more informed by graphic design history and the sort of graphical organization and structure of knowledge, and his much more by traditional bibliographical studies and textual studies, though he's very interested in the graphical expression and material expression of aesthetic artifacts. So it was a very productive partnership and exchange, and one of those wonderful gifts that happens sometimes in life where you just sort of have the right set of conditions. We had a terrific community at Virginia, and it was really exciting. And that community changed and shifted and sort of dispersed, but for a particular moment, which lasted about 5 to 7 years, it was one of the most exciting environments I had ever been in. I've been in some other exciting environments, but that was a really unique one.
It was a creative nexus of sorts, wasn't it?
It was, it was. And a community, which is very rare for scholars to actually have the opportunity to work in a team environment with full enthusiasm and partnership across all kinds of levels of graduate students, undergraduates, faculty, staff, professionals. It was really fun.
It's a rare luxury.
It is.
Something I'm glad you had a chance to take advantage of. Johanna, you're a very busy woman. You're a critic, you're an historian, you're a practitioner. Do all those bits of your work feed into each other?
Yes.
That's a good one-word answer. Well done. Tell me about your practice of the art of bookmaking now. When do you find time for it, and how do you go about it?
Right. Well, again, I'm fed very much by my historical research as well as by, dealing with contemporary life. And so, every book is a different project and is sparked by a different set of circumstances. And at the moment, I'm really interested in thinking about this problem of writing in electronic space. How can we take best advantage of the affordances of digital media and at the same time create an environment that is multi-platform? And I think I see that with the print community and the artist book community. And the multi-platform aspect is to consider what can you do with a project in digital space while producing a print-on-demand output that takes the book form, and also perhaps having something that lives in a gallery environment. And I do a lot of artwork, and so often the artwork then gets fed into a book project and changed in the process. And then again, I'm interested in how to work in a digital environment. One thing I'm really interested in is the problem of archives. A lot of friends who are coming of a certain age, where we're looking at what we're going to do in our dotage now, where we're thinking about how our archives are going to be managed and placed. And many people, and this came from a conversation with Harry Reese, Turkey Press in Santa Barbara, was to think about the extra value to archives resides not in the artifacts themselves, but in the web of relations that's anecdotal and historical. And how do we pass that into the archive environment? So creating some kind of a digital platform for doing archival work that allows anecdotes and personal information and that whole tissue of relations to be built around the artifacts and documents is really interesting to me.
So you're saying that maybe a digital environment is a useful way to try to capture some of what is usually an ephemeral or impermanent web around the creation of particular artwork?
Around particular artworks, and yes, and then that becomes part of the archive as well. So I think of it as kind of an infinite annotation space, but also one that allows networks of relations to be indicated. So that a work, for instance, might have had a relationship to 6 other works you've done before, conversations with 2 or 3 other people. There might be a body of correspondence that relates to it, and there might be all kinds of anecdotes and historical sort of recollections that you have that aren't recorded anywhere. And it's not, look, a lot of that will be made up, right? That's what we do. We make things up, right? We narrate our lives according to the moment in which we want to sort of imagine the scenario. But, to have an environment where that could actually be, annotated and structured and indicated. So we're working on some projects like that at UCLA right now to think about how you make that happen.
We're running out of time, so I need a quick answer to this last question.
Okay.
What are the most important tools in your workshop?
Ooh, I still love my pencils and my watercolors. I just did a little suite of drawings for a friend, and I sat down and just drew for a couple of hours with some watercolor and pencils, and I haven't been that happy in ages.
That's a great answer and a wonderful
I've had
place
these pencils for 40 years. It's still my same little Eagle turquoise that I got as an art student, and I just love them. So
I find that very reassuring. Johanna, thank you for taking the time to talk to me. It was a really wonderful little glimpse into the many things you do. Thanks. We've been speaking with author and book artist Johanna Drucker, the Martin and Bernard Breslauer Professor in the Department of Information Studies at the Graduate School of Education and Information Studies at UCLA. Her talks and workshop on April 16th and 17th, 2010 were part of the campus-wide Year of the Book series. Thank you for watching.